Everyone thought the Wakefield estate was a dream come true, nestled in the heart of fertile countryside, with endless fields of corn, sprawling farms full of crops, and white gravel paths leading into vast gardens. But for those who had ever stepped inside, it felt more like a forgotten castle than the home of a family. Grand, wealthy, and full of amenities, yet strangely devoid of warmth. Luxurious living rooms lay under a thin layer of dust, endless hallways echoed with no laughter, and thick curtains remained tightly drawn even at noon, turning sunlight into an unwelcome guest. The master of this place was Richard Wakefield, a 42-year-old man once praised as the king of agriculture for building an empire from the soil of his fields. Strong, decisive, admired by both the business world and the people of his hometown, Richard had once stood tall against every storm. Yet all the titles and profit margins became meaningless on that fateful day 4 years ago, when he lost his beloved wife, Emily. A hang-gliding accident had taken her in an instant, right when their daughter, little Luna, had just turned 3. That sudden death tore apart not only their family but also Richard's very spirit. The man who had withstood every market upheaval was left with nothing but an unending emptiness inside. From then on, Richard locked himself away in his own world. He rarely appeared at events, gradually reduced face-to-face meetings, and handed much of the business over to subordinates. Old friends came a few times but stopped, unable to bear the heavy atmosphere of a house too big and too cold. Richard was left with only one reason to live: his daughter, Luna. He poured all his love, protection, and even his despair into her. But the more he loved, the more powerless he felt, for Luna grew increasingly withdrawn. The 4-year-old girl had a round, lovely face, small lips often pressed shut, and striking gray-blue eyes tragically veiled by a misty haze. For the past 6 months, her eyesight had been steadily declining despite treatment. Richard followed the family doctor's instructions faithfully, administering eye drops at the right times and dosages. But each time he saw her eyes blur further after every drop, his heart tightened. He told himself, "I'm doing what's best for her." Yet deep inside, he feared he was leading his daughter into darkness. Luna's days passed in silence. She often sat for hours by the large living room window, clutching her worn teddy bear. Her eyes faced the garden, but never truly touched the scene outside. Children her age laughed in the sun, learned to ride bikes, or played in the mud, while Luna remained still, like a small statue. Sometimes Richard caught her shaking her head slightly, or whispering something to the bear, only to fall quiet again. Laughter, or the words "Daddy," had never once echoed through the mansion since Emily's passing. Richard would sit in the corner of the room, watching her with shadowed eyes. He told her fairy tales, played soft music, even brought out animal picture books, and described them aloud. The most he received in return were faint nods, or at best a vague furrow of her brow. He didn't know if she truly heard, truly felt, anything at all. The only thread he clung to was those rare, fleeting moments when Luna rested her head against his chest for a few seconds, as if to affirm the fragile bond still linking father and daughter. The Wakefield estate, seen from the outside, remained splendid and imposing, a symbol of wealth. But within, it was nothing more than a vast shell, imprisoning 2 lonely souls, a despairing father and a child lost in darkness. And though he had grown accustomed to emptiness, Richard still quietly hoped for a miracle, something that could bring light back to his daughter's life and to his own heart. Julia Bennett sat on an old bus rattling through the fields ready for harvest. She leaned her forehead against the fogged window, her eyes following the endless stretch of golden land. The road ahead felt both familiar and strange, as if carrying her away from the past yet pushing her straight into a new challenge she had not yet imagined. In the small bag resting on her lap were a few simple clothes, a worn notebook, and a knitted scarf her mother had made long ago. That was all Julia could call her belongings, all that remained of a life left behind. At 27, Julia had endured more loss than many women her age. She grew up in a poor suburban family where her parents labored until their old bodies could no longer bear it. They were in no position to support her, In fact, they now relied on her modest contributions to cover medicine and daily needs. Julia once believed marriage would open a brighter path, but only a few years after a modest wedding, her hopes collapsed. She could not have children. Doctors examined her again and again, offering vague explanations, perhaps psychological, perhaps physical incompatibility. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Each month brought fresh disappointment, and each time her husband turned away, Julia felt the distance between them stretch wider. In the end, he left her, carving a wound inside her that no words could soothe. The broken marriage also shattered Julia's faith in herself. She lost not only a partner but also the chance to be a mother, a dream simple yet burning within her. She felt like a failure, incomplete in her family, incapable of building happiness. After the divorce, Julia lived quietly, working odd jobs, cleaning, babysitting, and kitchen help, not out of passion, but simply to survive and send a little money home to her parents. Yet in those small jobs, Julia discovered a strength. She was patient with children. Families who hired her for a few hours often remarked that their kids seemed calmer in her presence. She didn't force, didn't scold. She simply stayed close, letting them draw comfort from her gentle presence. One rainy morning, Julia noticed a small advertisement in a newspaper at the store where she worked. Full-time nanny wanted. Workplace, Wakefield estate. She hesitated. Wakefield, the name was not unfamiliar. Everyone knew Richard Wakefield, the agricultural tycoon who had turned ordinary fields into enormous wealth. But his name was also surrounded by whispers. He had lost his wife, lived alone with a daughter, said to have vision problems. Many had been invited to work there, yet none stayed long. Julia read the ad several times, torn. She wasn't sure she was capable, nor did she know if she could fit into a house heavy with someone else's grief. But deep in her heart, she longed to try. Not because of the promised salary, but because the chance touched her secret pain. To be near a child, to give the love she had never been able to give her own. That afternoon, Julia stood before the large iron gates of Wakefield Estate. White gravel stretched on both sides of the driveway, tall poplars casting long shadows across the ground. The house appeared in the distance like a pale fortress, imposing yet cold. Julia tightened her grip on her bag and drew a long breath. A mix of nerves filled her chest, part excitement, part restraint, as if each step was carrying her into another world, one she wasn't sure she belonged to. The housekeeper opened the door, a neatly dressed older woman with a polite yet firm voice. She led Julia down a long paneled hallway, the scent of polished wax lingering in the air, and stopped at a heavy double door. "Mr. Wakefield is waiting in his study," she said softly. Julia nodded her thanks, her heart racing, her palms damp with sweat. Richard Wakefield rose as Julia entered. He wore a plain white shirt, his sinewy arms still tanned from days spent in the fields. His dark brown hair was streaked with gray, his shave careless, his deep-set eyes carrying long-held weariness. He cast Julia a short glance, not warm, not cold, simply a silent test. Julia returned his gaze calmly, neither looking down nor pretending confidence. "You are Julia Bennett?" Richard asked, his voice husky but steady. "Yes," she replied simply. He looked down at the thin file on his desk, flipping through papers he had clearly read before. "I've interviewed many," he said, pausing to weigh his words. "Most have experience, credentials. But I don't need someone here to display qualifications. I need someone who knows how to be silent when needed, and patient." Julia gave a slight nod. "I have little to show, sir, but I know how to wait, and I know how to listen." For a fleeting moment, surprise flickered in Richard's eyes. The coolness in his manner softened, replaced with quiet scrutiny. "My daughter, she is not like other children," he said slowly. "She speaks little, reacts little. Many have left within weeks. They said she was too difficult, or too silent." "Silence," Julia answered gently, "does not mean emptiness. It only means others haven't found the way in yet." Her words held him still for a long moment. Finally, Richard rose, gesturing for Julia to follow. The hallway led to a small room at the far end of the house. When the door opened, Julia saw a quiet scene. Luna sat curled by the window, eyes turned outward yet vacant, arms wrapped tightly around a worn teddy bear. She seemed unaware of the stranger's presence. Richard stopped at the threshold, not stepping inside. Julia, too, didn't rush forward. She only set her bag down gently, took a seat on a chair against the wall, and kept silent. After a while, Luna stirred faintly, as if sensing another breath in the room. Her long lashes trembled, but she only clutched the bear tighter, saying nothing. Julia smiled softly, not at the child directly but at the window. "This window is so large. In summer, you must be able to see all the green fields from here." Luna didn't reply, but her tiny hand unconsciously stroked the bear's ear. The small motion was brief, but enough for Julia to understand. A fragile bridge had just been laid down. Richard, watching from behind, felt something stir within him. He said nothing, only gave the slightest nod, as if admitting the woman before him had passed an unspoken test. When Julia stood, she turned to him, her voice steady yet gentle. "I'll start tomorrow," he answered shortly. "Good." Julia left the room with a strange feeling, not victory, not relief. Simply the awareness that she had taken her first step into a world her heart might have been waiting for all along. The first days at Wakefield Estate passed as if Julia had stepped into a world where every sound was swallowed whole. The house was too vast, its endless rooms strung together like corridors in a dream, and in every space lingered a dense silence, heavy enough to touch. Julia worked with her familiar hands, never making more noise than necessary. In the mornings, she rose early, walking through mist-filled hallways, straightening bed linens, tidying a kitchen already so spotless there was little left to clean. Each step she took was careful, as though afraid of breaking something invisible. In the corner of the living room sat Luna, as still as a porcelain figurine. The little girl clutched her worn teddy bear, her eyes directed toward the wide glass window overlooking the garden. But Julia knew she didn't really see much, if anything. The view beyond was nothing more than blurred patches of color bleeding into one another. What haunted Julia was not the cloudy eye, but the small face devoid of any spark. No smile, no curiosity, not even the flashes of temper so common in children. Only an unbroken silence, stretching on, making the large room feel even larger. Richard often appeared in this scene like a shadow. He never entered fully, only stood at the end of the hallway or by the doorway, watching his daughter. His eyes brimmed with tenderness, yet also with helplessness. Julia once caught that look, and the two shared only a brief nod. Nothing more was needed. It was already too clear. A father clinging desperately to what little remained, yet unable to find the way closer. One afternoon, sunlight slipped through the curtains, laying a long streak across the carpet. Julia, stacking towels, asked softly, almost as if speaking to herself, "Do you like the sunshine, Luna?" The child didn't turn, didn't answer. But Julia noticed a small shift in her shoulders, her head tilting ever so slightly, as if to listen. To anyone else, it might have meant nothing. But to Julia, it was a fragile bridge, proof that inside the silence something still lived. At night, Julia sat at the small table in her room, her hands resting on the old notebook. She didn't write, only stared at the blank pages. Her mind circled back to the image of the little girl by the window. There was something painfully familiar in it, as if she were looking at her own reflection in the days after leaving her broken marriage, sitting alone, silent, clutching loss with nowhere to lay it down. She exhaled softly, whispering an unspoken vow. If she could, she would awaken those dim eyes not only to see the light, but to know she was not alone in this world. Gradually, Julia realized the silence of the estate was not only born of grief, but of habit. The housekeeper moved like a shadow, her steps hardly echoing on the wooden floor. The driver lingered outside, seldom offering even a greeting. The gardener trimmed roses in the mornings without a whistle, without a hum, like gardeners usually do. Everyone seemed to obey an unspoken law, preserve the quiet, as if noise might crack the fragile world of Richard and his daughter. Yet that very silence hollowed the house into a shell where no one truly lived. They merely existed. Julia chose differently. She didn't shatter the quiet with noise, but neither did she let herself fade into shadow. She carried her small tasks into the same room where Luna sat, sewing a button back onto a blouse, folding table linens, wiping dust from picture frames. Simple gestures, yet as her hands moved, the room felt less empty. At first, Luna paid no attention, but soon Julia noticed. When the needle pierced cloth, the girl's eyes flickered. When the rag rustled over wood, her grip on the teddy slowed. Subtle reactions, but to Julia, they were signals from a hidden world, sent out for anyone patient enough to see. One evening, Julia tried again to speak. She was polishing the window frame and asked softly, "You like sitting here because the window is so big, don't you?" Luna did not answer, only tilted her head a little, her cloudy eyes still gazing far away. Julia smiled, not waiting. For her, that slight tilt was already a reply, a silent nod in the child's own language. At night, Julia often passed the nursery before retiring to her room. From the crack in the door, she heard Richard reading aloud. His voice was low, sometimes hoarse, with pauses longer than the text demanded, as if to catch breath or swallow down sorrow. Luna remained silent, but Richard pressed on, page after page, as though he, too, needed the stories to keep himself standing. From the hallway, Julia felt a lump rise in her throat. In that moment, she understood. Richard's pain was as deep as the emptiness in Luna's eyes. Father and daughter were trapped in separate worlds, neither knowing how to cross over. That night, Julia sat by her window, staring into the dim garden. She thought of Luna's eyes, the fleeting reactions, Richard's sorrowful voice, and she realized the little girl's greatest fear was not just the darkness clouding her vision, but the gulf between her and her father. He was there every day, yet his presence hovered like a shadow behind her. Luna had not found a way to call him closer, nor any language to voice what stirred within her. Julia clenched her hands softly, vowing to herself, if there were a way, she would find a crack in that shell of silence, to let the light in, not only for Luna's eyes, but for her small heart, so it might finally meet the hand of the father waiting just beyond the door. Mornings at Wakefield Estate always began the same, sunlight seeping faintly through the thick curtains, the hesitant chirping of birds outside quickly swallowed by the silence that blanketed the house. Julia had grown used to this rhythm, yet one thought still weighed on her heart. Each day, Luna lingered only in a few rooms, or sat for hours by the window seat, clutching her teddy bear. At 4 years old, she had never run beneath the morning sky, never breathed the scent of damp grass, never listened clearly to the chatter of sparrows in the trees. Her entire world was walls, hallways, and silence. That morning, Julia decided to break the cycle. She told the housekeeper she wanted to take Luna outside just for a little change of air. The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded, perhaps trusting Julia's gentleness. Taking the child's small limp hand in hers, Julia led her out the back door. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and the faint sweetness of roses still wet with dew. Luna froze on the doorstep. Her little shoulders trembled as if startled by something unfamiliar. Julia bent down, whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe here." Gently, she guided the girl to the lawn behind the house, where the sun had just risen above the trees. Soft golden light poured down, bright but not harsh. Julia sat beside her, watching every small movement. At first, Luna only hugged her teddy tighter, her face still blank. But when a breeze rustled through the branches and a ray of sunlight slanted across her face, Julia saw her lashes flutter, her head tilt slightly as if to avoid it. The pupils of her eyes contracted, not an imagined reflex, but a real response. Julia's heart pounded, her throat dry. She didn't want to frighten the child. Carefully, she shifted her position, brushing aside a branch, to let the sunlight fall more clearly. Again, Luna blinked. This time her lips moved faintly, as though murmuring something too soft to hear. Julia lifted her hand to shield some of the glare, and saw Luna's small shoulders slowly relax, the tension in her little face easing. For the first time, Luna edged closer, resting her tiny frame against Julia's arm, as if seeking shelter. In that moment, Julia's eyes blurred with tears. For days, she had seen nothing but a motionless child trapped in shadows. Now, beneath the morning sun, the little girl had responded, moved, revealed something alive within. It was fragile, but to Julia it was like a candle lit after too long in darkness. She smiled, stroking the child's soft hair, whispering inside her heart, "You can see, can't you, Luna?" Luna didn't answer, only clutched her teddy tighter. But Julia believed it. That reaction was no accident. She knew she had just witnessed something vital, the first crack of light piercing through the heavy dark surrounding this child's life. That afternoon, when the household had quieted, Julia walked to Richard's study. She paused at the half-closed door, hearing the shuffle of papers and a weary sigh. Drawing a breath, she knocked softly. "Come in," his voice called, tired yet firm. Richard sat behind the heavy desk, pen in hand, though clearly not writing. When Julia entered, he looked up, his eyes questioning her presence. She stepped closer, hands clasped tightly, heart racing. "Mr. Wakefield," she began carefully, "this morning I took Luna outside for a little while, just in the back garden, only briefly." He froze, his brows furrowing. "Outside? Yes." Julia nodded, speaking quickly before his temper rose. "I thought the fresh morning air might be good for her. And I noticed something." She drew a breath, then spoke with unshaken honesty. The sunlight touched her face, and she blinked. Her pupils reacted. She even tilted her head. "I believe Luna can still perceive light, at least in some measure." Richard laid the pen down, his gaze sharpening. "What did you say?" She truly responded. Julia insisted, her voice trembling but resolute. "I think this could be a sign for treatment. Perhaps." "Enough." His voice cut like a blade, cold and sharp. He shot to his feet, towering, his frame filling the room. "You had no right to take my daughter outside. The doctors warned me her eyes are too weak. Any direct light could make it worse. Do you understand that if your recklessness blinds her forever, what that would mean?" Julia froze, as if doused in ice water. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "I only thought I saw a sign. There is no sign." Richard's voice was harsh, fear laced with anger. "I've heard enough outsiders feeding false hope. She cannot see, and I will not let anyone plant hope only to break her heart again. Do you understand?" Silence pressed heavily in the room. Julia bowed her head, hands trembling. His words cut deep, but in her heart, she knew what she had seen. Swallowing hard, she whispered, "Yes, I understand." Richard sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. This time, his sigh was not anger, but the same exhaustion and despair that had bound him for 4 long years. Quietly, Julia turned, stepping out as if afraid even her footsteps might cause something else to break. At the end of the hallway, she stopped, her heart still pounding, but her eyes glinting with resolve. Richard might not believe her. The world might not believe her. But she would not dismiss what she had witnessed. She was certain. Behind the haze, Luna's eyes still held some light. And one day, with all the patience she could give, Julia would prove it. After the heavy conversation with Richard, Julia became more cautious in everything she did. She didn't want to anger him again, nor lose the fragile trust she had only just begun to build. Yet inside, the image of Luna blinking under the morning sun stayed etched in her memory, a mark that could not be erased. Julia knew she hadn't been mistaken. Something in those small eyes was still alive, still responsive, still trying to break free from the fog that bound them. One afternoon, when the house held nothing but the ticking of the clock, and the light through the windows was beginning to fade, Julia decided to try. She quietly pulled her phone from her pocket, switched on the small flashlight, and a thin beam of bluish-white light appeared like a slender arrow. Sitting down on the carpet, she held the light low by her side, then slowly shifted it. Luna sat opposite, teddy bear in her arms, her gaze vacant. Julia's heart thudded, her chest tight with the fear that she was fooling herself. She moved the beam slightly to the left. Then so faintly Luna's long lashes fluttered. The cloudy pupil tightened, as though a signal had just passed through. Julia held her breath. She shifted the beam to the right, slowly, careful not to distress the child. Once again, Luna's head tilted ever so slightly, not entirely away, not entirely toward it, but undeniably a response. Julia trembled, her palms damp with sweat. She lifted the light higher, then lowered it to eye level. The pupils contracted, then widened, like a bud testing the air before opening. Julia sat frozen, eyes wide, throat parched, as if witnessing a miracle. For days, everyone believed Luna lived in total darkness. Yet here, before her own eyes, Julia saw the child still carried a fragile thread connecting her to light. Quickly, she switched the light off, afraid of tiring her. Luna blinked softly, then hugged her teddy again, her small shoulders loosening when Julia's hand brushed her hair. "It's all right," Julia whispered. "We'll take it slowly." The child didn't answer, only leaned her head a little deeper into the bear. But for Julia that was enough, a faint spark of hope. Inwardly, she recorded every detail: the flutter of lashes, the change in pupils, the slight tilt of the head. Each is a small clue, but priceless. Julia knew she had taken another step in the journey to bring back Luna's light, but it was also a dangerous step, one that could cost her this job at any moment. That night, the mansion sank once more into thick silence. Each room lay in shadow, only thin trails of yellow light spilling along the endless hallway. Julia lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. Again and again, her mind replayed the afternoon, the fluttering lashes, the contracting pupils, the tiny tilt of Luna's head. Those images burned bright, refusing to fade, no matter how tightly she closed her eyes. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her own heart racing. For years, Julia had learned to live with emptiness. Since her marriage collapsed, she had been alone, never daring to dwell on children. Passing a park, seeing mothers cradle babies or children running free, she always turned away quickly, as though dodging a blade. Infertility hadn't killed her in one blow. It gnawed slowly, day by day, leaving her with the constant ache of being incomplete. Now, with Luna responding to a thread of light, Julia felt that emptiness tremble, not because she thought of the child as her own, but because in that moment she realized she still had the capacity to care, to reach into a child's world. The hope she glimpsed in Luna's eyes was not only for the girl, it was for herself too. Proof that she was not useless, that the love of a mother still had a place to grow inside her. She turned, staring at the dark window. The distant chirr of crickets drifted through the garden like a faraway song. She thought of Richard, of the weight he carried, of the fear that kept him locking his daughter in this house. She understood why he did it, yet also believed that the very chains meant to protect Luna were the same ones holding her down. Closing her eyes, Julia whispered in her heart, "If she were my child, I would never let her stay in darkness this long." That night, Julia didn't sleep. She sat up, opened the old notebook she hadn't touched in months. Her hand trembled as she lifted the pen, and she wrote a few crooked lines. Light. Her eyes still reached for light. The ink smudged with falling tears, but Julia felt her heart ease. Even if scolded, even if dismissed as delusion, she knew she would not stop. She would keep testing, keep watching, keep noting every sign until the truth could no longer be denied. Dr. Samuel Harrington had been tied to the Wakefield family for more than a decade, a name Richard always trusted. Once a childhood friend, he later became their private physician, caring for Emily and then Luna from the day the child was born. To Richard, Harrington was not only a doctor but a companion through life's upheavals. That was why, during a brief follow-up appointment, when small talk drifted toward Luna, Richard confessed, "Julia said the girl responded to light. I don't believe it, but I thought if you confirmed, it would settle the matter." His words sounded more like a man trying to put down fragile hope than lift it. Harrington paused his pen for a moment, the corner of his lips lifting in a smile too faint to read. "That's only a false reflex," he replied swiftly, his tone firm. "The optic nerves are damaged. Don't let the nanny plant foolish illusions in your mind." The message came on a quiet morning. Julia had just placed a folded stack of linens neatly on the shelf when her phone buzzed. An unknown number, a single line. "Stop. Don't meddle in what isn't yours." No name, no signature, only a chill that seeped through the words. Julia froze, her finger hovering above the screen. The wide room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. She told no one. All that day, Julia moved calmly through her tasks, sitting near Luna as usual, but inside, questions rang endlessly. Who sent it? Who knew? The feeling of invisible eyes watching made her shiver. The next afternoon, Harrington arrived. He came as always, in a pressed gray suit, polite smile in place, shaking Richard's hand with the warmth of an old friend. Yet when his eyes slid briefly toward Julia, she instinctively clutched at her sleeve. For a fleeting second, she felt certain he knew everything. Richard sank heavily into a chair, looking wearier than usual. "How is she?" he asked, voice rough and slow. Harrington set down his leather case, fingers interlaced, then answered decisively, "Luna's condition remains dangerous. I've told you before, Wakefield, if you stop the medication, the risk of permanent blindness is almost certain. Do you really want to gamble with your daughter's sight?" Silence filled the room. Julia heard her own heart thundering, her hands gone cold. Richard said nothing, only lowered his head, his face darkening. The question struck at the core of his greatest fear. Julia wanted to speak, to say she had seen Luna respond to light, but when she looked at Richard, she knew he could not bear one more word that contradicted the doctor. The fear he carried for 4 long years was too heavy, and Harrington knew exactly how to press it. "You may listen to anyone," Harrington went on, voice calm as ever, "but this is medicine. If I say it, you must believe it." Then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking toward Julia once more. Brief, but long enough to send a chill down her spine. She lowered her eyes, hiding the tension. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps only her imagination, but when she remembered the anonymous message from the day before, her chest sank. In this already silent house, it seemed another kind of darkness was spreading, coiling around her and the fragile child alike. When Harrington left, the parlor still felt weighted, as though stones pressed the air. Richard sat unmoving for a long while, one broad hand covering half his face. He said nothing, but Julia saw his shoulders tremble, fear and helplessness leaking through. "He's right," Richard finally muttered, his voice breaking. "If we stop the medicine, she could lose her sight forever." Each word landed like a hammer, sealing shut the narrow door of hope Julia had tried to open. She sat quietly, her hands pressed hard against her thighs, nails digging into skin. She wanted to object, to insist she had witnessed something real, but in Richard's haunted eyes she saw it. Her words would vanish like a stone cast into a bottomless gorge. The father was too exhausted to discern truth from fear. That evening, the house grew tighter still. Richard hardly spoke, barely touched his food before retreating upstairs. Julia stayed with Luna in the parlor. The warm lamplight fell across the child's face, casting the teddy bear's shadow long across the carpet. Julia studied her for a long while, her chest aching. If all this was an illusion, as Harrington claimed, why had she seen pupils contract? Why had Luna blinked at the sunlight? Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket, making her jump. Another message, the same unknown number. "Don't let curiosity become your regret." Julia's chest constricted, her fingers numb. She glanced at Luna, then shoved the phone back quickly. Someone was clearly watching every step she took. That night, Julia lay awake in her room. The wind hissed through the window frame, a sound that seemed to echo the warning she had just read. She shut her eyes, trying to banish fear, but the image of Luna's small eyes returned again and again, flickering between light and shadow. She remembered the child she had lost, the void that followed when no faint cry filled her arms. That ache rose again now, sharp and relentless, whenever she thought of Luna. She knew silence would keep her safe, but it would also condemn a child to remain in darkness in every sense. Julia turned restlessly, clutching her pillow like a decision she had not yet made. No, I can't abandon her. The whisper broke from her lips into the night, fragile yet firm. The next morning, Julia saw Richard in the kitchen. His face was drawn, with shadows under his eyes. He poured coffee, his hand shaking so badly that drops spilled across the table. Julia longed to say something to steady him, but remained quiet. The gulf between them had widened, fed by the fear Harrington had planted. Yet within Julia, a resolve had formed. She could not rely on Richard to act, not now. He was too bound by dread, so it had to be her. With patience, with courage, with love, she would find a way to prove that Luna had not lost the light. Julia had thought about it for many sleepless nights. Lying on the narrow bed, she listened to the whistle of wind through the window frame, the scattered chirps of insects in the garden. Again and again, the image returned to her. Luna curled in the shadows, silent, clutching her bear. Julia's chest tightened with each memory. The child needed more than medicine, more than walls and suffocating protection. She needed air, sunlight, the feeling of being a child. Julia believed that only by stepping outside could Luna have a chance to heal. The next morning dawned clear and blue, a gentle breeze carrying soft sunlight across the back garden. Julia held Luna's small limp hand in hers. "Would you like to come outside for a bit?" she asked, her voice a tender invitation. Luna did not answer, only blinked faintly and clutched her teddy tighter. Julia didn't press, only smiled and opened the door. Cool air drifted in, fragrant with roses and freshly cut grass. At the threshold, Luna stopped, shoulders tensed. Julia bent low, whispering, "I'm here. It's safe, Luna. Step by, careful step." She guided her onto the sunlit lawn. Light shimmered on dew still clinging to leaves. Birds trilled from the trees. Bees hummed among the blooms. At first, Luna stood still, shrinking in on herself, gripping the bear so tightly her small fingers trembled. Then a breeze lifted her hair, brushing it across her face. Slowly, her chin tilted upward. Julia caught it, those clouded eyes flickering, blinking not with emptiness but with something new. The child drew in a long breath, her small chest rising as if for the first time she knew how to breathe with her whole body. Julia lowered herself to the grass beside her, smoothing a hand over the girl's soft hair. "See? Out here is so much lovelier than inside," she whispered. Luna said nothing, but her bare foot edged forward, pressing gently into the cool, damp grass. A flicker of a smile, faint but undeniable, touched her lips. Tears stung Julia's eyes. This was no longer an experiment. This was a child learning to live again, to feel freedom after too many days caged by adult fears. And Julia, with nothing but patience and tenderness, had opened a tiny door for her. The crunch of hurried footsteps on gravel startled her. Julia turned. Richard stood at the path from the house, sunlight sharpening the anger in his features. His eyes locked onto the scene. His daughter, small and fragile, in the blazing garden, her nanny's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "What do you think you're doing with my daughter?" His voice sliced the air, heavy and raw. Julia sprang to her feet, face pale. I only wanted her to breathe some fresh air. Out here." "Fresh air?" Richard's words cut like a whip as he strode toward them. "I told you. She cannot be exposed to direct light. The doctors warned us. Do you want her blind forever?" Julia swallowed hard, fists tightening in her skirt. "Mr. Wakefield, please listen. I believe the sunlight will help her, not just her eyes, but her spirit. She needs to live as a child, not be locked in four walls." "Silence," Richard barked, his voice breaking with fury and despair. He loomed above her, a wall of shadow. "Do you think you know more than a doctor? Do you think a few days as her nanny gives you the right to decide her health?" Julia trembled but held her ground. "I'm not a doctor. but I'm with her every hour. I've seen how she responds to light. I know she still has hope. You may not believe me, but don't deny what I've witnessed with my own eyes." Richard's fists clenched, his breath ragged. Pain flashed in his gaze, the old terror of losing another loved one, the ghost of Emily's death. He looked at his daughter, saw her small shoulders trembling, the teddy crushed out of shape in her grip. The sight only stoked his fear, fanning his anger higher. "You're frightening her," he roared, turning on Julia. "Get her inside before you destroy everything." Julia's throat closed, tears brimming, yet she stood firm by Luna's side. The bright garden felt suddenly suffocating, every sound swallowed by tension. Only 3 figures remained in the world: a father breaking under fear, a nanny clinging to fragile faith, and a child caught in the middle, her tiny hands shaking around her bear, her clouded eyes lifting toward the light. The air felt ready to shatter. Richard towered, voice hoarse with rage and dread. Julia, tear-streaked, refused to move her hand from the child's shoulder. The sunlight seemed to trap them in a glass cage. And then, a sound pierced it small, trembling, but clear enough to break the silence wide open. I saw a light." Richard froze. He spun, eyes wide, disbelieving. Julia, too, went still, her hand shaking. Both of them stood as though a miracle had spoken. Luna remained where she was, Teddy clutched tight, her dim eyes glinting with a fragile spark. She blinked, tilted her face toward the shaft of sunlight slipping through the branches. Her lips moved again, quivering yet steady. "I saw a light. Oh God," Julia whispered, tears spilling freely. She dropped to her knees, clutching the child's cold little hand, gripping it as though to anchor belief. "You saw it, didn't you, Luna? You saw the light." Richard staggered back, his hand groping for the stone bench behind him. His knees wavered, the ground seeming to shift beneath him. For years, he had lived convinced his daughter would remain forever in darkness. Time after time, he had rejected hope to protect himself from crushing disappointment. And now, with a few halting words, his world crumbled and rebuilt in the same breath. "It can't be," he whispered, voice raw. "Emily, if you can hear me, our daughter, she just spoke." Julia lifted her gaze to him, her tear-streaked face glowing, with conviction. "Mr. Wakefield, it isn't an illusion. I've seen the signs for weeks, and today, Luna herself said it. She still has light." Richard's hand covered his face, his breathing broken. A sob escaped not of the powerful businessman, but of a father who had stumbled into hope again. He knelt beside his child, his large hands trembling on her shoulders. "Luna, was it true? Did you really see the light?" The girl said nothing more, only buried her face against his shoulder. Teddy held close. Yet her eyes blinked softly, catching a glimmer of gold in the sun. For Richard, it was enough proof he had not dreamed it. Julia stood nearby, tears falling unchecked. In that moment, she knew she had not only saved a child, she had restored a father's broken heart. And she, a woman who once believed she had no chance at motherhood, was now living to witness a child's first light, a miracle for all 3 of them. The garden hushed. Then birdsong rose again, fuller, brighter, as though celebrating the return of life. Sunlight poured across the 3 figures. A father, mended by hope, a nanny, redeemed by love, and a little girl who had finally touched the light after so long in the dark. The night after Luna whispered that she had seen light, the Wakefield estate remained shrouded in its familiar silence. But for Julia, everything had changed. Each step, each breath carried the echo of that fragile voice. She saw the light. Not a dream, not an illusion, truth. Richard, however, was different. Since that moment, his words had grown fewer. He avoided Julia's gaze, and when he was with his daughter, he held her more tightly, as if letting go even for a second might mean losing her forever. Julia understood he wasn't ready to believe. The fear of hoping and then being broken again was too much for him to bear. At dinner, Julia sat across from him, watching as he stirred a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Summoning all her courage, she spoke softly. "Mr. Wakefield, about what happened this morning, I have a suggestion." Richard looked up, his tired eyes hollow and searching. Julia continued, calm but urgent. "Please, don't tell Dr. Harrington yet. At least not now. We don't fully understand what's happening. I think it would be best to keep this between us." Observe her longer. His brows furrowed. "You want me to hide this from him? Harrington is my friend. He's been with this family for years." "Exactly," Julia said quickly. "And that's why we need to be sure. If all we have is a fragile clue, telling him now will crush it immediately. Please give me a chance. I'll take care of Luna, watch her every day. And," she drew a breath, "please let me handle the eye drops. I'll record everything carefully. When we have undeniable proof, then we'll tell him." Silence filled the room. Richard set the spoon down, clasping his hands, his eyes fixed on the table. Julia waited, heart racing. He could reject her outright. He could explode. Instead, he sighed, voice raw from deep within. "Do you know what I fear most? Hope. Every time I hope, I lose a little more of myself." Julia met his gaze, her own, eyes glistening. "I once lost faith, too, in ever becoming a mother. But Luna showed me. Sometimes miracles come when we wait with patience. Please, trust me this time. If I'm wrong, I'll take full responsibility." Richard's eyes wavered. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, you'll take care of it. But Julia," his voice dropped, heavy and hoarse, "if anything happens to her, I'll never forgive myself. And I won't forgive you either." Julia bowed her head, accepting the weight of his words. "I understand." From that day, she officially took charge of administering Luna's medication. Each morning, she sat by the window with the girl, gently tilting her head to drop the cool liquid into her clouded eyes. Luna never resisted, only clutched her teddy tighter. But Julia noticed. Each time the drops fell, Luna's lashes trembled, her whole body flinched, as if recoiling from discomfort. Julia carefully noted every detail in her small notebook, her mind stirring with unease. Something wasn't right. Sooner or later, she would need to uncover the truth about this medicine. A few days later, Harrington returned to the estate. He arrived, as always, dignified in a pressed gray suit, black leather case in hand, wearing that half-smile that suggested he alone held salvation for this family. Richard welcomed him in the parlor, his eyes weary yet tinged with hope. Julia stood quietly behind, pulse quickening as the heavy door closed, sealing them together in the thick air. Harrington lowered himself into the armchair, opened his case, and looked directly at Richard. "Wakefield, I've contacted colleagues in Europe. A special medicine for Luna has been ordered. But you must understand, this is an extremely rare formulation, not easy to produce. It will take about 2 weeks before it arrives." He paused, then leaned forward, his voice deepening. "In the meantime, you must not stop the current drops. Both treatments are crucial. If you miss even one day, the risk of permanent blindness multiplies." Julia's grip tightened on her notebook. Her mind replayed the images, Luna's lashes fluttering, her body jolting slightly with each drop. She had recorded it over and over, and now, as Harrington pressed his warning, her suspicion grew sharper. He continued, his tone shifting into that of a salesman. "When the special medicine arrives, I'll personally perform the surgery. It's delicate, requiring the utmost precision. Only my hands, golden hands, are capable of restoring her sight completely. If anyone else touches her, all hope will be lost." He stopped, his eyes gleaming as they swept over Richard. Then, with deliberate emphasis, "The medication and surgery will cost $10 million. Expensive, yes, but you have my guarantee 100%. Luna will see again." The room fell silent. Richard sat rigid, his broad hand gripping the armrest. Money had never been his concern. But the figure 10 million and the absolute promise of 100% cure left him stunned. Inside him, desperation to save his child clashed with the dread of failure. suffocating him. Julia, meanwhile, felt each word pierce her like a blade. 10 million? 100% certain? That was not the language of medicine. That was the language of a man selling dreams at a merciless price. His confident smile, his calculating eyes, everything about Harrington radiated cold manipulation. Finally, Richard nodded, his voice low. "Fine, prepare everything." He pushed the small box of drops across the table toward Julia. "You'll keep administering this. Record everything." I'm not strong enough." Julia bowed her head, palms damp as she accepted the box. When she looked up, her eyes caught Luna's figure in the corner, hugging her bear in silence. For a moment, Julia saw herself in that child, lost, fragile, trapped in a game with no choices. Her grip tightened around the bottle. If the truth lay hidden in these drops, she would find it, and she vowed silently. This time, no one would steal the light from Luna again. Julia sat on the hard bus seat, both hands gripping the cloth bag on her lap. Inside, wedged between tissues and a bottle of water, were two of Luna's medicine bottles. She tried to keep a calm demeanor, like a housemaid out for a weekend errand. Outside the window, fields stretched in bands of green and gold, early summer wind making the leaves shimmer in the sun. Julia looked without really seeing. All that filled her mind was Luna's image, the small girl hugging her teddy bear, her clouded eyes blinking whenever the drops fell, her whole body giving a faint shiver as if resisting discomfort. The scene haunted Julia every night, urging her to find an answer. The bus stopped at a small town more than 40 minutes from the estate. Julia got off and merged into the sparse trickle of people on the street. She walked quickly to a modest red brick building with a sign over the door. Community Center, Charity Clinic. On weekends it was open for free to poor laborers and elderly people living alone. Julia had stopped by once to help in the kitchen for a charity lunch, and there she met Mr. Miller, a retired pharmacist who spent most of his time volunteering. Inside, the center was noisy but warm, children playing in a corner, a few elderly people waiting to be seen. Julia headed straight for a small room lined with shelves of bottles and basic equipment. Mr. Miller was bent over arranging medications, thin of frame but with bright eyes behind his glasses. "Julia, I recognize you," he said with a surprised smile. "Here to volunteer?" Julia shook her head slightly, her voice trembling but firm. "No, today I need a favor." She took out the two bottles and set them gently on the table. "These are what my employer is using for his daughter. I want to know if there's any problem. The girl seems uncomfortable when I apply the drops." Mr. Miller frowned, took the bottles, and after a quiet moment looked up, his voice lowering. "These ingredients are familiar. In fact, they're two common medications, one a mild anti-inflammatory, the other a corneal lubricant. Used separately, they're perfectly safe." Julia swallowed, her heart dropping a beat. Then, why is her vision blurred? He set the tray down, his tone turning grave. "But if these two are used together, in parallel, and over many months, they will gradually crystallize on the cornea. The result is a cloudy film that blocks light, not permanent blindness, but a severe reduction in vision, like looking through a sheet of frosted glass." Julia went still, her hands clenched white. The image of Luna fading into darkness over the past 6 months flashed in her mind, and now she understood. It wasn't fate but the result of a human hand. Mr. Miller looked at her and added slowly, "An experienced physician would certainly know this. This cannot be a mistake." Julia dropped into a chair, her eyes blurring. So many questions, so many doubts. All converged into one harsh truth. Luna had never been born blind. The child's blurred vision was the product of calculation. "Could you write me a brief statement of these findings?" Julia asked, her voice choked yet steady. Mr. Miller nodded, quickly wrote it up, and stamped it. Julia took the paper, feeling it as heavy as a verdict. On the ride back, she sat in silence, the paper tucked safely in her bag, her hand gripping the notebook. Watching the sparse traffic on the rural road, she thought of Richard. He had placed all his trust in an old friend, while that very man had cast darkness over his daughter's life. Julia drew a deep breath, determination lighting her eyes. Whether Richard believed her or not, whatever Harrington's reaction, the truth had to come to light. She would not let anyone steal Luna's light for even one more day. That afternoon, the sky turned gloomy, and black clouds covered the wide land around the Wakefield estate. Julia sat in the parlor, the statement from Mr. Miller and her densely filled notebook before her. Richard sat silent on the opposite chair, his large hands intertwined, his face gaunt like a man who had just lost his last support. He had read every word, and had seen clearly. Two harmless drugs on their own, but together and prolonged, they create a cloudy film on the cornea. He could deny it no longer. A knock sounded. The housekeeper opened the door for Harrington. He entered in the same elegant suit, wearing the same confident smile. "Richard, I've come to check on Luna. We have much to prepare." Julia rose and stepped forward. "You don't need to check her. Today we have questions for you." Harrington lifted an eyebrow, then sat in the armchair, arms folded. "Sounds serious. Is the nanny here to teach me how to practice medicine?" Julia drew a breath and laid the papers on the table. "These are the analysis results of the medications you prescribed for Luna. Separately, they're safe. Together, used over time, they crystallize and create a film that clouds the eyes. You knew that, didn't you?" Harrington frowned, then let out a thin laugh. "Cheap analysis from a community lab, what value does that have? This is advanced therapy. You're not qualified to understand." Richard remained silent, his gaze fixed on the man. Julia continued, her tone sharper. "If it were just an error, an experienced doctor would have recognized it from the start. Mr. Miller, a pharmacist with 30 years' experience, has confirmed this could not be accidental." A crack ran through Harrington's calm. He stared at Julia, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Listen, girl. If you keep meddling, you'll regret it. What does a nanny know? Do you think a few worthless papers can ruin my reputation?" Julia stiffened, but before she could answer, Richard suddenly stood. Tall and looming, his voice rumbled with fury. "Enough, Harrington. I've been silent too long. She doesn't only have the analysis. She has a log of every reaction my daughter has had, and I have seen my child change with my own eyes. If you don't tell the truth right now, I'll call the police." Harrington gave a harsh laugh, but the corners of his mouth trembled. "Call them. Go ahead, let's see what a nanny and a widower can use to bring me down." He turned on Julia, his voice rising, frayed by panic. "You think the police will believe you? You're just hired help." Julia clenched the statement in her hand, unblinking. The air in the room grew heavy as stone. Richard said nothing more. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling as they slid across the screen. In that instant, Harrington blanched. The defiance in his eyes vanished, stripped down to naked fear. Don't call!" he burst out, his voice choking. Staggering, he collapsed to his knees, both hands on the floor. "All right, I'll talk. At first it was only minor symptoms. The girl cried too much after Emily died, redness, mild inflammation. I only meant to prescribe something to ease it. But," he swallowed, tears welling, "I was in debt. I lost everything gambling. I was terrified my reputation would fall apart. I thought, if I prolonged the treatment, I'd have more time, more money to pay it back. I didn't mean to harm the child, Richard, I swear." Then suddenly dropping fully to his knees, his voice broke. "You're my friend. All these years, I've cared for your family. Please, don't hand me over to the police. I just need a chance to make it right." Richard stood rigid, his fists shaking. Tears rose, but his voice held firm. "Friends, don't turn my daughter into a hostage for their greed. You betrayed me and your profession. I will not forgive you. Get out of my house." The next morning, police arrived at Wakefield Estate. They collected all the evidence: Julia's meticulous notebook, the pharmacist's analysis, and Richard's own testimony. By afternoon, news had spread. Dr. Harrington had been arrested, his head bowed as he stepped into the police car, a far cry from the image of the respectable family physician he once projected. A week later, the medical board revoked his license. He now faced prison for fraud and endangering a patient. That chapter closed in disgrace. But for the Wakefield family, the real battle was only beginning. The journey to bring back Luna's light. Richard and Julia took the girl to a major hospital in the city. After thorough examinations, a team of specialists delivered their verdict. Luna's eyes were not permanently damaged. The cloudy films were the result of prolonged misuse of conflicting medications. With proper treatment, she can gradually regain her sight, the doctor said with conviction. Richard sat frozen, then pulled his daughter into his arms, tears streaming not of despair this time, but of relief, of release. Julia stood nearby, her throat tight, her heart swelling. In that moment, every sacrifice, every fear she had endured felt worth it. In the days that followed, life inside the estate began to change. No longer evenings suffocated by silence, but appointments for follow-ups, hours of vision therapy, and at last the sound of Luna's laughter echoing softly through the halls. Julia patiently sat with her, covering one eye, holding up colored cards. "What color is this, Luna?" she asked gently. The little girl blinked, hesitated, then whispered, "Red." It was the first time in months she had named a color. Julia hugged her tightly, tears and laughter mingling. Richard changed too. No longer locking himself away in his study for hours, he began walking in the garden with his daughter, letting her feel the sun and wind on her skin. Julia often glimpsed him, sitting beneath a tree, telling Luna stories about her mother, his voice unsteady but warm. Sometimes he fell silent, gaze far away, then murmured, "Emily, do you see? Our little girl is finding her way back to the light." One evening, after Luna had fallen asleep, Richard found Julia on the porch. The golden lamplight revealed the deep lines on his face, carved by years of fear and grief. "Julia," he began slowly, "I've lived in fear for too long. I thought keeping her locked inside was the only way to protect her. But I was wrong. You dared to do what I could not." He paused, eyes distant, then returned to her with quiet sincerity. "Thank you for giving the light back to both of us." Julia bowed her head, her heart trembling. She shared her own story, her broken marriage, the wound of infertility that left her feeling useless and alone. Richard listened without interruption. When she finished, he laid a steady hand on her shoulder, his eyes full of understanding. "Perhaps we both need healing," he said, and for the first time, Julia believed it was true. Autumn arrived, painting the apple orchard red. Julia walked with Luna beneath the branches, leaves rustling underfoot. The girl inhaled deeply, her eyes widening, blinking in the sunlight. "Julia," she whispered, "I see. Red. Overcome." Julia pulled her close, tears spilling in joy. From a distance, Richard approached, watching. He said nothing, only came to stand beside them, his hand brushing Julia's. In that quiet gesture, without promises, all three understood. A new family was being born out of brokenness. As evening fell, they sat together on the steps. Luna rested her head on Julia's shoulder, her eyes glimmering as they followed the fading light. Richard wrapped his arms around them both, holding them close. Luna's laughter rang out, clear and bright, shattering the darkness that had once haunted the house. The light had returned not only to the little girl's eyes, but to all their hearts. And this was only the beginning. A year passed, and the Wakefield estate looked nothing like before. Where silence and shadow had once ruled, now light and laughter filled every corner. The back garden bloomed with flowers, and golden afternoons echoed with conversation and children's play, replacing the heavy stillness of the past. Richard and Julia held a small, intimate wedding beneath the great oak tree on the family grounds. There was no lavish display, only those who truly loved them, close friends, neighbors, and most importantly, Luna. She stood in a white dress, radiant as a little angel, holding a bouquet she presented to her father and new mother. Richard clasped Julia's hand, his eyes shining with a happiness he hadn't known in years. A true, new beginning. And then, a miracle. Julia discovered she was pregnant. The news came unexpectedly, and tears spilled the moment she saw the tiny red line on the test. For years, she had believed she was barren, that her first marriage had crumbled because she couldn't have children. But now she realized perhaps it had only been stress, or incompatibility with her former husband. Trembling, she held the ultrasound results close and whispered, "So, I can still be a mother." When she told Richard, he fell silent, then lifted her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with a joy that made him seem decades younger. Luna, too, was overjoyed. She was no longer just a child in need of healing, but a proud big sister. For months, she often pressed her ear to her mother's belly, whispering to the baby inside, "It's me, Luna. When you're born, I'll take you out to play." Each time Julia saw that, her heart brimmed with a love she once thought she would never know. 3 years later, on the first day of school, morning sunlight bathed the narrow road leading to the gates. Luna, nearly 8, held the hand of her 3-year-old sibling and skipped happily toward the entrance. She turned and called out brightly, "This is my little brother." Her clear voice carried far, drawing smiles from those around. Richard and Julia followed behind, hand in hand, their eyes fixed on the children. Richard murmured, "I never thought I'd find happiness again like this." Julia leaned her head against his shoulder, answering with a gentle smile. No words were needed. The moment spoke for itself. At the school gates, Luna stopped and waved back. "Mom, Dad, hurry up," she called. Richard and Julia burst into laughter and quickened their steps. In their eyes, the light reflected not only the morning sun, but also love, faith, and the bond of family. In the new light of the Wakefield family, one truth shone clearly: miracles do not come from medicine alone, but from courage, patience, and love. When hearts are healed, every darkness fades. The final message rang out like a promise. Light comes not only through the eyes, but through love and faith. When the heart is healed, miracles happen. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit like to spread love, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story of hope and humanity. Share this video because somewhere out there, someone may be waiting for a spark of light in their life.